Margaret's neighborhood was the kind of place where nothing ever really happened. The lawns were neatly trimmed, mailboxes stood in perfect rows, and the occasional dog walker or jogger passed by with a friendly nod. It was quiet, predictable, a place where people respected boundaries. Or at least, that's what she had always believed. The summer air was thick and heavy as she turned onto her street, the setting sun casting long shadows over the rooftops. She sighed, rolling her shoulders, feeling the weight of the day settle deep into her bones. It had been exhausting, errands, groceries, a long wait at the pharmacy. All she wanted now was to step inside, kick off her shoes, and enjoy a peaceful evening. She pulled into the driveway, the tires crunching softly against the gravel. As she reached for her bags, something caught her eye. Movement. Faint, but unmistakable. Margaret froze, her fingers tightening around the steering wheel. Through the gaps in her wooden fence she could see them. People. At first, she thought it was just a couple of kids, maybe neighborhood children chasing a lost ball. But then she heard it. Laughter. The unmistakable splash of water. Music, faint, but definitely playing from somewhere in her backyard. Her heart rate ticked up. Slowly, she stepped out of the car, closing the door quietly behind her. She moved toward the fence, peering through the slats, and felt her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't just a couple of kids. 3 teenagers lounged in her pool as if they had every right to be there. One of them floated on an inflatable raft, arms stretched behind his head, eyes closed in complete relaxation. Another perched on the pool's edge, kicking at the water absent-mindedly, while the third rummaged through a bag of chips, scattering crumbs onto the patio. Margaret's lounge chairs had been claimed. Towels, none of which belonged to her, were draped over them, as if this were some kind of resort. She felt a slow, simmering heat rise in her chest. How long had this been happening? Had they been coming here while she was out? She took a steadying breath and moved toward the sliding glass door. No shouting. No panic. Not yet. The door slid open with a soft shuck, the sound barely noticeable beneath the noise of their chatter. She stepped outside, letting the screen door slap shut behind her. That got their attention. The boy on the raft cracked one eye open, startled. The girl at the edge of the pool whipped her head around, gripping her phone like a lifeline. The one with the chips nearly dropped the bag. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Margaret crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. One of them stammered. "We thought nobody was home." She held their gaze, voice calm but firm. "That's the problem, isn't it?" The first time Margaret noticed something strange, she brushed it off. It was early morning, the sun barely cresting over the rooftops, casting a golden glow across her backyard. As she stepped onto the patio with her coffee, she felt the coolness of the morning air against her skin. Everything seemed normal, quiet, peaceful. But then, as she took another step forward, her brow furrowed. There were wet footprints on the patio. At first, she thought maybe it was an animal, a raccoon perhaps, or a stray cat that had wandered too close to the water. But as she looked closer, she saw they weren't paw prints. They were human footprints, scattered across the stone tiles, leading from the pool to the fence. Some were faint, already drying in the rising heat, but others were fresh, still glistening. A strange unease settled in her stomach. Setting her coffee down, Margaret moved toward the pool. The water was calm now, but something was off. Floating near the deep end was a crumpled soda can, bobbing lazily with the ripples. She leaned down, fishing it out, shaking her head. It wasn't hers. That's odd, she thought. Had the wind blown it in? Maybe a kid had tossed it over the fence. She glanced around. Nothing else seemed out of place. The backyard was still and quiet, the only sound the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. Shrugging off the discomfort, she tossed the can into the trash and went inside. But the next morning it happened again. This time there was more than just footprints. A damp towel, one she didn't recognize, was draped over one of her lounge chairs. Another soda can floated in the pool. A single flip-flop lay abandoned near the steps. Margaret frowned, glancing around as if expecting someone to step out from the bushes and claim them. She took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe some kids had mistaken her backyard for a public space. She lived in a suburban neighborhood. Houses were close together, backyards sometimes blurred. It was possible. Still, the thought nagged at her. That evening, she made a point to check the yard before bed. Everything was in its place. The pool was clear, the chairs were empty, and the patio was dry. Satisfied, she locked the doors and went to sleep. But by morning, the footprints were back. And this time, there were more of them. Margaret's jaw tightened as she surveyed the scene. A half-eaten granola bar lay discarded on the table. The towel was still there, now crumpled, as if someone had used it again. Her grip on her coffee cup tightened. This wasn't a mistake. Someone had been here. And whoever it was, they weren't planning on stopping. Margaret had a sinking feeling that the footprints and trash weren't just a one-time thing. But she hadn't expected to catch them in the act. It was early evening, the sky painted in soft hues of pink and orange. A warm breeze rustled the trees as Margaret stepped onto her back porch, a cup of tea cradled in her hands. She had just settled into her chair when something made her pause. A sound, faint but unmistakable. Splashing. Her grip on the cup tightened. Moving slowly, she set the tea down and crept toward the patio door, careful not to make a sound. She peeked through the curtains, her eyes narrowing. There in her pool were 3 teenagers. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. They weren't just swimming. They were making themselves at home. One boy floated on his back, arms spread wide, eyes closed in relaxation. Another perched at the edge of the pool, idly kicking at the water. The third, lean, shirtless, and full of misplaced confidence, was rummaging through a bag of chips, leaving a trail of crumbs across her patio. She inhaled sharply through her nose, forcing herself to stay calm. It was one thing to find footprints in the morning. It was another to stand here and watch strangers invade her space as if they owned it. Enough. With quiet precision, she slid open the glass door and stepped outside. The screen door slapped shut behind her. The sound echoed through the yard. Instantly, the atmosphere shifted. The boy on the raft cracked one eye open. The girl perched at the pool's edge froze, fingers tightening around her phone. The one eating chips nearly dropped the bag. For a long, heavy moment, no one moved. Then, as if jolted into action, the boy on the raft scrambled upright, nearly tipping over. The girl hopped to her feet so fast, she almost lost her balance. "Oh, the third boy stammered, his voice unsteady. "We thought nobody was home." Margaret folded her arms, her expression unreadable. "That's the problem, isn't it?" she said coolly. Silence. Then, as if sensing they were on dangerous ground, the teenagers sprang into action. They clambered out of the pool, water dripping onto the patio as they grabbed their towels and half-eaten snacks. The girl fumbled with her phone, avoiding Margaret's gaze. The raft, forgotten, bobbed gently in the water. None of them said another word. They just ran. Margaret didn't stop them. She watched as they darted through the gate, disappearing into the neighborhood, leaving behind nothing but wet footprints and an opened bag of chips. She let out a slow breath. Maybe that was enough. Maybe they had learned their lesson. She would soon realize she was wrong. Margaret had hoped that catching the teenagers in the act would be the end of it, that the embarrassment of being confronted would be enough to keep them away. But as the days passed, it became painfully clear. She had underestimated just how little people respected boundaries. It started small. A few more footprints. A damp towel left crumpled by the pool steps. The occasional soda can floating lazily in the deep end. At first, she convinced herself it was leftover evidence from that one incident. Maybe they had come back just once more to test their luck. But then things escalated. One afternoon, she stepped outside to find her lounge chairs occupied, not by teenagers this time, but by 2 women in oversized sunglasses, reclining as if they were at a resort. A toddler splashed noisily in the shallow end while another child sat at her patio table, swinging his legs and munching on crackers. Margaret's stomach tightened. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a case of kids sneaking in for a quick thrill. This was something worse. This was entitlement. She took a slow, steadying breath before approaching. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You're in my backyard." One of the women barely looked up from her phone. "Oh, I know," she replied casually. "The kids just wanted to cool off. We'll be out soon." Margaret's jaw clenched. "That's not the point," she said, crossing her arms. "You didn't ask." The woman sighed heavily, finally lowering her sunglasses. "It's just a pool," she said with a dismissive shrug. "You're not even using it." Margaret felt something snap inside her. The audacity, the absolute nerve of these people, to treat her home as if it were public property, to act as if she were the one being unreasonable for wanting control over her own space. Taking a deep breath, she leveled her gaze at the woman. "It's my pool," she said coldly, "and I'd like you to leave." The woman scoffed but reluctantly gathered her things. "You really don't have to be so uptight," she muttered under her breath, waving for the kids to follow. Margaret didn't respond. She didn't have to. She simply stood there, watching as they shuffled toward the gate, leaving the latch hanging open behind them, almost like an invitation. That was when she knew. Being polite wasn't going to work. Leaving notes, making requests, even directly confronting these people, it wouldn't matter. They didn't care. They had decided that her space was theirs to use as they pleased, and as long as the pool remained, they would keep coming back. Margaret exhaled slowly, a plan already forming in her mind. If they refused to respect her property, then she would take away the very thing they were trespassing for. One way or another, this would be the last summer anyone set foot in her pool. Margaret had always believed in the power of civility. A firm but polite request, a reasonable conversation. Surely that would be enough to put an end to this madness. She was wrong. It was mid-afternoon when she stepped outside, the sun casting sharp rays across the patio. The scent of chlorine hung in the air, mingling with something else, sunscreen maybe, or entitlement. Because there, stretched out in one of her lounge chairs, was a woman Margaret didn't recognize. She wore oversized sunglasses, her blonde hair piled into a loose bun. One arm draped lazily over the chair's side, the other held a phone, her fingers scrolling with absent-minded ease. A plastic cup of something cold sat beside her on the patio table. Margaret's stomach twisted. Just beyond her, two children shrieked as they splashed through the pool, utterly oblivious. A half-eaten bag of chips was overturned near the water's edge, crumbs dotting the pavement. A pair of discarded flip-flops sat near the steps. This wasn't an accident. Margaret tightened her grip on the screen door and let it slam shut behind her. The sound cracked through the humid air, but the woman barely flinched. Margaret stepped forward, her voice even. "Excuse me. You're in my backyard." The woman didn't even look up. "Oh, I know." She gestured vaguely toward the pool, still focused on her phone. "The kids just wanted to cool off. We won't be long." Margaret blinked. For a second, she thought she had misheard. That somehow this stranger lounging in her chair, in her backyard, had misunderstood where she was. But no, the nonchalance in her tone made it clear. She knew exactly what she was doing. Margaret inhaled sharply. "That's not the point," she said, her voice steel beneath its calm exterior. "You didn't ask." Now the woman lowered her sunglasses, tilting her head slightly as if Margaret were the unreasonable one. "It's just a pool," she said with a shrug. "You're not even using it." Margaret felt heat rise up her spine, but she kept her expression neutral. The audacity of it all. She took a slow, measured step forward. "It's my pool," she said, "and I'd like you to leave." For the first time, something in the woman's face shifted. Annoyance, maybe even mild embarrassment. But instead of apologizing, she let out a dramatic sigh and waved toward the kids. "Come on," she called, standing up. "Some people don't know how to share." Margaret didn't react. She just stood there, watching as the woman gathered her things, muttering under her breath. The kids, dripping wet, reluctantly followed her through the open gate, the same gate they had left wide open, as if they'd be back. Aunt Margaret realized then this wasn't over. Being polite wasn't going to fix this. Something had to change. Margaret had tried to be patient. She had tried to be reasonable. But patience and reason didn't seem to matter to people who saw her backyard as their personal retreat. The morning after the confrontation, she bought a sign, big, bold, impossible to miss. Private property. No curious passing. The red letters stood out starkly against the white background. She hammered it onto the fence herself, stepping back to admire her work. That should do it. It didn't. 2 days later, the sign was gone. Not fallen, not knocked loose by the wind, ripped clean off the fence, leaving behind only 2 bent nails and a fresh sense of fury simmering in her chest. Fine. If a sign wasn't enough, she'd take it a step further. She went to the hardware store and bought a heavy-duty padlock for the gate. A good solid one. The kind that sent a clear message, "You are not welcome here." The next morning she found the lock hanging open, snapped in half. Margaret stared at it, her fingers tightening around the broken metal. A slow, seething heat built in her stomach. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. Her backyard was no longer just a temptation. It was a challenge. And these people, whoever they were, had decided to test just how far they could push her. That evening, she made another trip to the police station. She didn't call 911. This wasn't an emergency, at least not in their eyes. But she figured a non-emergency report might at least put something on record. Maybe an officer's presence would be enough to scare them off. She sat across from a weary-looking officer, explaining everything, the intrusions, the broken lock, the blatant disregard for her space. When she was finished, the officer simply shrugged. "It's a civil matter, ma'am," he said. "If you catch them in the act, you can file a trespassing report. But unless they damage property or steal something, there's not much we can do." Margaret swallowed the sharp retort rising in her throat. Catch them in the act? Was she supposed to spend her days lurking behind curtains, waiting for strangers to invade her home again? She was 72, not a security guard. She left the station feeling more frustrated than before. The law wasn't going to help her. Signs weren't going to stop them. And clearly, locks weren't enough of a deterrent. That night, she sat on her porch, staring at the yard that was supposed to be hers. The warm glow of the setting sun bathed the pool in soft light, making it look almost peaceful, almost inviting. And that was the problem, wasn't it? As long as the pool was there, sparkling, tempting, people would keep coming. And if they wouldn't stop themselves, then Margaret would stop them herself. The heat that day was suffocating, the kind that made the air thick and heavy, pressing down on everything like an unbearable weight. Margaret had spent the morning running errands, trying to keep her mind off the frustration that had been simmering inside her for weeks. All she wanted was to come home, unload her groceries, and sit in the shade with a cold glass of lemonade. But the moment she pulled into her driveway, she knew peace was not in her future. Music, loud music, laughter, splashing. Margaret's hands tightened around the steering wheel as she stared at her house, her backyard, her space that no longer felt like her own. Through the gaps in the fence, she saw them. Not just a few kids sneaking in for a quick dip. Whole families. Coolers lined up along her patio. A grill smoking. Pool floats bobbing in the water, some occupied by parents who looked too comfortable to at home. And then her eyes locked onto her. The same woman from before, the one who had dismissed her, the one who had treated Margaret's boundaries like a joke. She was reclining on one of Margaret's lounge chairs, sipping from a plastic cup, looking as relaxed as if she had just booked a resort vacation. Margaret sat there in her car for a long moment, just breathing. This wasn't just disrespect. This was brazen. She grabbed her grocery bags and walked up the steps, her movements slow and deliberate. She pushed open the back door with a little more force than necessary, the sound barely registering over the chaos outside. And yet, no one noticed her. Not one person. Not until she stepped forward, her voice sharp and commanding. "Excuse me." No one turned. She took another step. I said, "Excuse me." Finally, a few heads swiveled toward her. The music continued blaring, the kids kept shrieking, but some of the adults had at least the decency to look startled. The woman in the chair sighed and lowered her drink as if she were being inconvenienced. "Oh, hey, Margaret." Margaret stared. "Hey." That's all she had to say. Her gaze swept over the strangers who had invaded her home, still floating, still eating, still acting like she was the outsider here. Something inside her snapped. "You need to get out. All of you." The woman sat up, adjusting her sunglasses. "Come on, it's just a little fun. No harm, no foul." Margaret let out a short, humorless laugh. "No harm? You broke my lock. You ignored my signs. You treated my home like a public park." The woman shrugged. "It's a hot day." Margaret's pulse pounded in her ears. She wasn't asking again. And by tomorrow she was going to make damn sure this never happened again. Margaret barely slept that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene over and over. The laughter, the music, the way they had dismissed her, as if she was the problem, as if she was unreasonable for wanting control over her own home. She had tried everything, politeness, warnings, even the police. None of it mattered. Because they didn't respect her. And people like that wouldn't stop until they were forced to. By morning, she had made up her mind. With her first cup of coffee still in hand, she reached for her phone and made the call. The man on the other end sounded confused. "You want to get rid of it entirely?" he asked. "That's right," Margaret said, her voice steady. A long pause, then a chuckle. "Ma'am, do you know how much work that's gonna be?" Margaret smiled for the first time in days. "More work than breaking my lock? More than ignoring my signs? More than treating me like I don't exist?" Another pause, then, "Fair enough. We can start tomorrow." That was all she needed to hear. Margaret spent the rest of the day on her porch, watching. She didn't have to wait long. By noon, the woman from next door appeared, leaning over the fence. "You getting work done?" she asked, squinting at the yard. Margaret took a sip of her coffee. "Sure am." The woman frowned, scanning the orange tape marking the pool's edges. "What kind of work?" Margaret didn't answer. She just let the silence stretch. By afternoon, the rumors had already begun. Someone had seen her talking to a contractor. Someone else noticed a cement truck scheduled for delivery. By nightfall, the same woman who had lounged in her chair, like she owned it, finally came knocking. Margaret opened the door, keeping her face neutral. "You're not actually..." The woman hesitated, shifting her weight. "You're not getting rid of the pool, are you?" Margaret tilted her head. "Why do you care?" The woman scoffed, crossing her arms. It's such a nice feature. A lot of us enjoy it." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Us?" The woman blinked. "Exactly," Margaret said, voice cool. "And that's the problem." She shut the door before the woman could reply. Margaret knew this decision wouldn't be popular. She also didn't care. Because by this time tomorrow, her backyard would no longer be their playground. And for the first time in months, it would finally be hers. By sunrise, the real show had begun. Margaret sat on her porch, coffee in hand, watching as the first truck pulled up. A flatbed carrying demolition equipment. Half an hour later, a second truck arrived, this one filled with a crew of workers in reflective vests and hard hats. They moved with purpose, unloading tools, prepping the site. She wasn't the only one watching. At first, it was just a few neighbors peeking through their curtains. Then more of them started stepping onto their porches, lingering on driveways, pretending to water their lawns just to get a better look. Then she appeared. The woman from next door stormed across the lawn, sandals slapping angrily against the pavement. "What the hell is this?" Margaret didn't even blink. "Construction." The woman's eyes darted toward the heavy equipment. "You're actually doing it?" she asked, her voice rising with disbelief. "You're really tearing out the pool?" Margaret took a slow sip of her coffee. "I thought you said it was just a pool." The woman's jaw tightened. "You're overreacting." Margaret just smiled, not saying another word. She didn't have to, because at that moment the first machine roared to life. A jackhammer cracked through the morning silence, splitting the tiles into jagged pieces. The woman flinched. The other neighbors stood frozen, watching in stunned silence. Someone murmured, "She's actually doing it." Damn right she was. The destruction was quick, merciless. By mid-morning, the once pristine blue water had been drained, leaving behind an ugly, empty crater. The workers wasted no time shoveling, breaking apart, hauling debris away. Margaret didn't look away. She watched every second of it. And she savored it. By noon, the complaints started trickling in. Someone, probably her, had called the HOA. Didn't matter. Margaret had checked the rules. Nothing prohibited her from removing a pool on her own property. Another neighbor had the nerve to say, "But that pool was a staple of the community." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Funny," she said dryly. "I don't remember putting in a community pool." And just like that, the argument died. Because what could they say? They had trespassed. They had ignored her warnings. They had pushed her too far. And now they were paying the price. By sunset, the final truck rolled in, pouring a smooth, flat slab of fresh concrete over the empty pit where the pool had once been. No more water. No more lounge chairs. No more uninvited guests. Margaret took a deep breath, letting the silence settle around her. For the first time in months, her backyard was truly hers. And she had never felt better. By morning, Margaret's backyard was unrecognizable. Where once there had been still, glistening water, there was now only chaos. Dust and debris filled the air, the sharp crack of machinery splitting through the early quiet. The first jackhammer struck the pool's tile, sending shards flying. The sound was deafening, but to Margaret, it was the sweetest noise she had heard in months. She sat on her porch, coffee in hand, watching as her problem was reduced to rubble. The workers moved quickly, their orange vests spread against the gray concrete dust. Heavy boots stomped across what had once been her patio, now littered with broken tiles and shattered coping stones. A backhoe rumbled into place, its bucket poised like a predator, ready to tear into what remained. And of course, the neighbors were watching. First, it was just a few, peeking from their windows, lingering on porches. Then more of them gathered, stepping onto driveways, whispering amongst themselves. Some of them looked shocked, others annoyed. Margaret could feel their stares, their disapproval hanging in the air like humidity before a storm. She didn't care. Then came her. The woman from next door stormed over, eyes wide with disbelief, her sandals slapping loudly against the pavement. "You can't be serious," she sputtered, waving toward the mess. "You're actually doing this?" Margaret took a slow sip of coffee, savoring the taste. "Looks like it." The woman's gaze darted to the workers, then back to the crumbling pool. "This is insane. Do you have any idea how much that pool was worth?" Margaret tilted her head. "Do you?" The woman let out a sharp breath, clearly struggling to find the right words. Finally, she huffed, crossing her arms. "You're ruining this for everyone." Margaret gave her a level stare. "Funny. I don't remember it ever belonging to everyone." The woman's mouth opened, then snapped shut. Margaret turned back to the demolition, dismissing her. She wasn't worth another second of her time. By midday, the pool was gone. The backhoe scooped out the last remnants of its walls, leaving behind nothing but a raw, gaping pit. Workers shoveled concrete dust into piles, their faces streaked with sweat. A cement truck rolled up just before sunset, pouring fresh, thick concrete over the ruins. Margaret watched as it spread smoothly across the ground, burying the last traces of what had once been there. By the time the workers packed up for the day, her backyard was quiet. No splashing, no music, no uninvited guests, just peace. Margaret stood at the edge of her new patio, running a hand over the smooth surface. It wasn't just a change, it was a statement. And by the looks of the silent, gawking neighbors, they had finally gotten the message. The morning after the demolition, Margaret stepped onto her back porch and took a deep breath. For the first time in months, there was no noise, no laughter, no splashing, no strangers lounging in her chairs, drinking her lemonade, treating her backyard like a community park. The silence was so unfamiliar that it almost felt unnatural. But Margaret welcomed it. She ran her hand across the smooth surface of the freshly poured concrete. The pool was gone, buried, erased, nothing more than a memory now. Some might have seen an empty space, a loss. But Margaret? She saw freedom. Of course, not everyone agreed. She could feel their eyes on her. The same neighbors who had ignored her signs, broken her locks, and dismissed her as some cranky old woman now lingered on their porches, whispering among themselves. They didn't have the nerve to say anything to her face. Not anymore, but their disappointment hung thick in the air. And then, as if on cue, she appeared. The woman from next door. Margaret didn't bother looking up as she heard the slow shuffle of hesitant footsteps. She continued kneeling in the dirt, planting roses along the edge of her new patio. A throat cleared. "So, what are you going to do with it?" the woman asked, her voice carefully neutral. Margaret dusted off her hands and stood, glancing over the smooth expanse of concrete. "Haven't decided yet," she said. "Maybe a garden. Maybe a fire pit. Whatever I want, really." The woman shifted uncomfortably. "You know, the kids are really disappointed." Margaret turned, her face unreadable. "Oh," she said, voice even. "Where were the kids when my signs were ignored? When my locks were broken? When my property was treated like a public park?" The woman had no answer for that. Instead, she exhaled sharply, shaking her head as if Margaret was the one being unreasonable. Without another word, she turned and walked away. Margaret watched her go, then returned to her work. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't even bitter. She had learned something. People will take whatever they think they can get away with. They will push, overstep, and test the limits of your kindness. And if you don't stop them, they won't stop themselves. Margaret had spent months waiting for them to respect her space. But in the end, she had to take that respect back for herself. She pressed another rose bush into the dirt, patting the soil into place. She might not have a pool anymore. But what she had now was so much better. Because it was hers, and only hers. Margaret stepped onto her new patio, a cup of coffee warming her hands. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh soil from the rose bushes she had planted along the edge. The pool was gone. No more splashing. No more music. No more uninvited guests. Just peace. She glanced around the neighborhood. The same people who had once lounged in her backyard now avoided her gaze. Some still whispered when they saw her, throwing disapproving looks her way. She didn't care. Not one of them had respected her when she asked nicely. Not one of them had stopped when she put up signs or changed the locks. They had ignored her until she took away what they wanted. And now suddenly she was the villain. Margaret smiled to herself. People will take what they can get away with. They will push until they're forced to stop. She had spent months waiting for them to respect her space. In the end, she had to make that respect non-negotiable. She took a slow sip of coffee, savoring the quiet. She might not have a pool anymore. But what she had now was hers, and that was worth everything.